In a tiny apartment in Nairobi, Wanjiku sat quietly, her hands trembling as she replayed Otieno's cruel words in her mind. "You are nothing but a liability," he had shouted, his face filled with anger. The words felt like knives cutting through her heart. She had given him love, loyalty, and sacrifice, but in return, she was left with pain. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she wondered how someone she once trusted could humiliate her so deeply. The more she watched Otieno, the more suspicious she became. He often left the house with excuses of business meetings, yet his pockets always seemed empty when she asked for help. Rumors spread that he was spending his time with another woman, and her heart grew heavy with doubt. One evening, unable to bear the whispers anymore, Wanjiku followed him quietly. To her shock, she found him laughing and dining with a beautiful woman named Zawadi. Later, she discovered the harsh truth. Otieno was paying Zawadi's rent in dollars, while she struggled to afford her next meal. Alone in her room that night, Wanjiku broke down completely. She remembered the days when Otieno had nothing, when she sold her jewelry to pay his fees, when she cooked and cared for him with everything she had. All those memories now burned inside her, replaced with betrayal and shame. But deep within, a quiet fire was lit. She chose not to seek revenge. Instead, she made a silent promise to herself: she would rise. With determination, she applied for a small loan and started sewing clothes. At first, people mocked her. "She thinks stitching will change her life," they laughed. But Wanjiku ignored their words. Day and night she worked, her fingers blistered, her eyes weary, yet her spirit unbroken. Slowly, customers began to notice her skill, and orders increased. Months later, her little business had grown into a thriving shop supplying boutiques across Nairobi. She paid her rent with pride, her bills without asking anyone, and carried herself with confidence. While she was rising, Otieno's flashy lifestyle crumbled. Zawadi left him the moment his money was gone, and with nowhere to turn, he came crawling back to Wanjiku. On his knees, he begged, "Please take me back. You are the only woman who cared for me." But Wanjiku looked into his eyes and said firmly, "You once called me a liability, yet I carried you when you had nothing. Now I am my own strength. You are the real liability." Standing tall in her busy shop, surrounded by workers she now employed, Wanjiku knew she had won. The woman once insulted had become unstoppable, and her story carried a lesson: never let anyone's words define your worth, because the same voice that breaks you today will one day witness your greatness. Wanjiku began to notice a strange pattern in Otieno's behavior. Almost every evening, he would dress up sharply and leave the house, claiming he had urgent business meetings. At first, she wanted to believe him, but something inside her whispered that his words were not true. He returned late at night smelling of expensive perfume she had never owned, his shirt creased in a way that told more than his mouth ever would. When she asked him about it, he snapped, calling her insecure and reminding her once again that she was a liability who added no value to his life. The neighborhood was small, and whispers traveled fast. Friends began hinting that Otieno was often seen in restaurants and hotels with another woman. They described her as glamorous, someone who walked with confidence, dressed in silk dresses, and carried herself like she owned the world. Wanjiku tried to ignore the rumors, but her heart could not rest. She started paying closer attention, and every day the signs grew clearer. Money became another painful proof. Whenever Wanjiku asked for help with groceries or rent, Otieno complained that he was broke. Yet she noticed bundles of cash disappearing from his drawer, and his phone buzzed with strange notifications whenever she was near. When she confronted him about the missing money, he grew defensive, his voice sharp and filled with insults. "Stop questioning me. You should be grateful I even keep you in this house," he shouted, while she stood quietly, swallowing the pain. Her suspicions hardened into certainty the day she saw him rushing out with a gift bag, smiling to himself as if he were a teenager in love. That smile had once been reserved for her, but now it belonged to someone else. Wanjiku's heart broke a little more each time she pieced together the puzzle. She realized she was living with a man who saw her as worthless but was willing to pour his earnings into another woman's life. Nights became longer, and silence filled her small apartment. She lay awake, wondering how the man she had supported when he was broke could now treat her like a burden. He called her useless, but she was the one who had cooked for him, cared for him, and sacrificed for him. Now, while she counted coins to buy food, he was spending freely on someone else, as if she no longer existed. Wanjiku carried the weight of this betrayal quietly, but deep inside, a storm was brewing, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. One evening, Wanjiku decided she could no longer sit in silence and drown in suspicion. When Otieno grabbed his jacket and rushed out, claiming another late business meeting, she quietly followed him at a distance. Her heart pounded with every step, her palms sweaty, but she moved carefully through the busy Nairobi streets, determined to uncover the truth. After a short walk, Otieno entered a lively restaurant filled with music and laughter. From outside the glass window, Wanjiku saw him sitting at a table with a glamorous woman. She was tall, elegant, her hair styled perfectly, her dress sparkling under the lights. Her name, whispered among neighbors before, now had a face, Zawadi. Wanjiku's chest tightened as she watched Otieno laugh freely, his eyes glowing in a way she had not seen in months. He leaned closer to Zawadi, whispering into her ear, pulling her hand playfully across the table. The man who often came home angry, complaining of poverty, looked like a wealthy, carefree lover in that moment. Wanjiku's heart sank deeper when the waiter brought them wine, the kind she could never afford. She stood frozen, tears forming in her eyes, but she forced herself to walk away quietly before Otieno could notice her. That night, she could not sleep. Images of Otieno's laughter with Zawadi replayed endlessly in her mind. The betrayal pierced through her like a knife. She remembered the hunger she had endured the previous week, counting coins to buy maize flour while Otieno claimed he had no money. Yet she had just seen him spend lavishly on another woman. The pain was unbearable, but worse was still to come. A few days later, Wanjiku overheard a conversation that shattered what little strength she had left. A mutual friend revealed that Otieno had been paying Zawadi's rent every single month, and not in shillings, but in dollars. The same man who insulted her as useless, who never contributed to their food or bills, was using foreign currency to keep another woman comfortable. The revelation left her numb. She had sacrificed everything for him, and now she was left to struggle alone, barely surviving, while he treated someone else like a queen. Wanjiku sat in her small room, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling abandoned and betrayed. Her stomach ached from hunger, her heart from heartbreak. She could not understand how love had turned into such cruelty. But deep inside, even through the tears, a spark of strength began to rise. She realized she was living with a man who would rather invest in another's comfort than value her loyalty. Wanjiku sat alone in her dimly lit room, the silence broken only by the sound of her own sobs. The betrayal had cut her deeply, but what hurt the most was the memory of everything she had done for Otieno when he was nothing. Her mind replayed the years they had shared, years where she carried his burdens as if they were her own. She remembered how he once came to her with empty pockets and heavy dreams, and she believed in him more than he believed in himself. There were nights when she went to bed hungry because she had given him her portion, just so he could focus on his studies. She remembered the days she walked miles to the market to find the cheapest food, stretching every coin to make sure he was fed. When his school fees threatened to end his education, she sold her gold earrings, her only inheritance from her late mother, because she wanted to see him succeed. Her sacrifices were endless, yet she made them willingly, telling herself that one day their future would be bright, built on love and trust. She thought of the time he fell sick and she nursed him tirelessly, sitting by his bedside, wiping his sweat, and praying for his recovery. She worked odd jobs, tailoring, washing clothes for neighbors, anything to make sure he had what he needed. Every small victory he achieved, she celebrated as if it were her own. She was his strength when the world dismissed him, his shoulder when life felt unbearable. Now, years later, the man she had built up stood tall not to appreciate her, but to tear her down with cruel words. "You are a liability," he had said, forgetting the countless times she had lifted him when he was drowning. He called her useless, yet it was her hands that clothed him, her sacrifices that kept him standing, her faith that pushed him forward. As she cried, her chest heavy with sorrow, she realized she had given her soul to someone who only saw her as a burden. The pain was unbearable, like a fire burning inside her chest. She looked around the small room where she lived, the cracked walls reminding her of how little she had left, even after giving everything. She felt empty, drained of hope, but beneath the pain, a quiet strength stirred. Though her heart was broken, she knew this was not the end of her story. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a whisper telling her that her tears would one day turn into power, and the same man who belittled her would live to regret every word. Wanjiku wiped her tears and chose not to let pain control her life. She could have cursed Otieno, could have plotted revenge, but she knew that would only keep her trapped in the same circle of misery. Instead, she decided to rise in silence. Deep inside her, a quiet determination grew, one that no insult or betrayal could crush. She told herself that if Otieno could abandon her after all she had done, then she must learn to stand on her own feet. She wanted her dignity back, and the only way was to build a life that depended on no one. One morning, she walked to a small microfinance office in the neighborhood. Her hands shook as she filled the forms, because she had never borrowed money before. But she convinced herself this risk was better than sitting helpless. With the little loan she secured, she bought fabric, threads, and a second-hand sewing machine. It was a modest start, but to her, it was a seed of hope planted in the soil of struggle. She set up a small corner in her apartment as her workshop and began stitching clothes. At first, she worked for long hours with little to show. Her fingers ached, her back hurt, but she refused to stop. Slowly, her talent began to shine through. Neighbors who had once mocked her started noticing her designs. Mothers brought their children's school uniforms, young women asked for dresses, and even men came for tailored shirts. With every stitch, she felt her confidence returning. She was no longer the woman who waited for Otieno to provide. She was creating her own path. Word of her skill spread quietly. Customers appreciated her neat finishing and creative styles. She worked late into the night, the hum of her sewing machine filling her tiny apartment with a rhythm of hope. Each payment she received was small, but it meant the world to her. It meant food on her table without begging, it meant rent paid without tears, it meant independence growing stronger each day. Though she told no one, she carried pride in her heart. She had turned her pain into power, and her silence into progress. The very man who once called her a liability had unknowingly pushed her toward discovering her true strength. She knew her journey had just begun, but with every customer walking through her door, Wanjiku felt the weight of betrayal lifting. She was no longer just surviving, she was rising. Wanjiku quickly learned that starting a business was not as easy as she had imagined. The small tailoring shop she opened with her microloan barely attracted customers in the first few weeks. Some people passed by, looked at her designs, and laughed. She thinks sewing clothes will change her life, they whispered loudly enough for her to hear. Others told her she was wasting her time, that a woman like her would never make it on her own. Each word was like a stone thrown at her, but she refused to let it break her spirit. Her days turned into endless hours of work. She woke before sunrise, sat behind her old sewing machine, and stitched until her eyes grew heavy at night. Her fingers blistered and bled from handling thick fabric, but she pressed on. When mistakes happened, she tore apart the seams and started again, determined to perfect her craft. Often, she went without sleep, pushing herself harder because she knew failure was not an option. She was tired, but inside her burned a hunger to prove everyone wrong. The hardest part was the lack of steady income. Sometimes she sold nothing for days, surviving on little food and endless hope. She had moments where she questioned herself, moments where she almost gave up. But every time doubt came, she remembered Otieno's words, "You are a liability," and those words became fuel. She refused to allow his insult to become her truth. Little by little, things began to change. A neighbor who once mocked her brought a torn dress for repair. Impressed with the neat work, she spread the word. Soon, children came with uniforms that needed stitching, brides-to-be came for gowns, and young men came asking for shirts. Slowly, the hum of her sewing machine became a sound of progress. Her tiny shop, once ignored, began to fill with voices of customers. The money was not much at first, but it was hers. She paid for food without borrowing, bought better fabric, and even managed to add small decorations to her shop to attract more people. The same neighbors who had laughed at her now watched with surprise as her confidence grew. Though the road was still difficult, Wanjiku felt a new strength in every coin she earned. Her journey was still beginning, but each day she survived the struggle, she knew she was no longer weak. She was building something real with her own hands, and her life was slowly transforming. Months passed, and the little sewing machine that once hummed in a corner of Wanjiku's room became the sound of success. What began with a few neighbors bringing simple repairs grew into something much bigger. Customers no longer came only from her street, people traveled from different parts of Nairobi just to have clothes tailored by her. Her designs, once ignored, started catching attention for their neatness and creativity. Word spread, and soon, boutiques in the city reached out, asking her to supply them with clothes in bulk. For the first time in years, Wanjiku saw money flowing steadily into her hands, and it was money she had earned on her own. The small room she once called a shop could no longer handle the demand. She rented a bigger space in a busy market, painted the walls bright, and proudly hung her own signboard outside. Walking into her shop every morning filled her with a pride she had never felt before. She remembered the days she begged Otieno for help with rent or food, only to be insulted. Now, she paid her own rent in full, cleared her bills without asking anyone, and still had enough left to save. Independence was no longer a dream, it was her reality. Her neighbors, who once mocked her, began to respect her. People who had looked down on her now greeted her with admiration. Women brought their daughters to her, telling them to learn strength from her story. Men in the area spoke of her as an example of resilience. Even children admired her, watching her work tirelessly in her shop. Wanjiku, once called useless, now walked with her head high, her steps filled with confidence. Every stitch she made carried a silent victory. Each bill she paid reminded her that she was no longer under anyone's mercy. For the first time, she looked in the mirror and saw not a broken woman, but a fighter who had turned betrayal into power. She did not just survive, she was thriving. Though Otieno's shadow still lingered in her memory, it no longer had the power to hurt her. She had built a name for herself, a business that stood strong, and a life that belonged to her alone. Nairobi now knew Wanjiku not as a burden, but as a woman of strength. And in her heart, she finally tasted the freedom she had always deserved. Otieno's life began to crumble slowly, though he did not notice it at first. The flashy lifestyle he had chosen with Zawadi demanded more money than he could keep up with. Expensive dinners, luxury clothes, and constant parties drained his pockets faster than he could refill them. What once felt like enjoyment soon became a burden, and his debts grew larger by the day. The business meetings he bragged about were nothing but lies, and without real income, his world started collapsing. Zawadi, the woman who once laughed with him in restaurants and smiled at his gifts, grew restless. She had been drawn to his money, not his heart. When the money began to disappear, her patience quickly faded. She complained about the cheap places he now took her, about the gifts that stopped coming, and about the late rent that worried her landlord. Otieno tried to hide his struggles, but the truth could not stay hidden forever. The moment he failed to pay her rent in dollars, Zawadi packed her things and walked away without a backward glance. Left alone, Otieno's confidence shattered. He went from man of style to man of shame, borrowing money from friends and dodging those he owed. The respect he once enjoyed vanished, and so did the company of people who only admired his wealth. He sat in silence, haunted by memories of how life used to be, realizing too late that he had wasted everything chasing emptiness. In his desperation, one name came back to him, Wanjiku. He remembered her cooking for him when he was broke, selling her jewelry to pay his school fees, standing by him when no one else did. He thought of the warmth of her care, something Zawadi had never given. But in his pride, he had thrown it all away. With no other option, Otieno swallowed his shame and returned to the woman he once called a liability. He stood outside her busy shop, watching people come in and out, admiring the success she had built. The sight humbled him. When he finally gathered the courage to approach her, his voice trembled as he begged for forgiveness. In his heart, he expected her to welcome him back, to remember the love they once shared and to save him from his misery. He believed she would still see the man she once carried, not realizing that the tables had turned, and Wanjiku was no longer the same woman he abandoned. Otieno's pride had crumbled completely. He found himself standing before Wanjiku's thriving shop, the place that had once been her small, struggling corner, now bustling with customers who admired her work. His heart raced, not with confidence, but with fear and regret. Each step toward her felt heavier than the last, his chest tight with shame. When he finally reached her, he sank to his knees, a gesture of desperation he had never imagined himself performing. His voice trembled as he spoke, "Please, take me back. You are the only woman who ever cared for me." Wanjiku looked down at him, calm and composed. Gone was the insecure girl who had once cried silently in her small apartment. In her eyes burned the fire of someone who had survived betrayal, pain, and struggle, and emerged stronger. She had built a life from scratch, a life Otieno had no part in creating. For the first time, she allowed herself a deep, steady breath, feeling the power of her own resilience. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading, and for a moment, Wanjiku felt a flicker of the past, the memories of shared dreams, sacrifices, and love. But she quickly remembered the countless nights she had gone hungry, the jewelry she had sold, the insults she had endured while he lavished money on another woman. Every memory was a weight, and she realized that forgiveness would not erase what he had done. She spoke slowly, her voice steady, each word carrying the strength of years of struggle. "You once called me a liability, yet I carried you when you had nothing," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I paid your bills, supported your dreams, and stood by you when no one else would. I never asked for gratitude, only respect, but all I received were insults and betrayal." Otieno flinched at her words, realizing the depth of her truth. Wanjiku paused, letting the silence emphasize her next words. "Now I am my own strength. I pay my own rent, run my own business, and build my life without needing anyone to lift me. You are the real liability, Otieno. You cannot stand without someone else holding you up, and you never respected the one who did." Otieno's shoulders sagged, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. He had expected tears, forgiveness, or desperation, but instead, he faced Wanjiku's unshakable strength. In that moment, the tables had turned completely. She was no longer the girl he could control or belittle. She was a woman who had risen above his cruelty, unbroken and victorious. Wanjiku stood in the middle of her bustling shop, the hum of sewing machines and the chatter of customers filling the air. Around her, young women and men moved efficiently, assisting clients and managing orders. This was her world now, a place she had built from the ground up with her own hands, heart, and determination. Each corner of the shop told a story of struggle transformed into success: the neatly stacked fabrics, the colorful designs hanging on the walls, and the satisfied smiles of customers who had come seeking her craftsmanship. She paused for a moment, looking around and remembering the girl she once was, the one who cried silently in a small apartment, called useless and a liability by the man she loved. She remembered the nights of hunger, the sacrifices, and the relentless hard work that seemed endless at the time. Every blistered finger, every sleepless night, every tear shed had led her here. The journey had not been easy, but it had shaped her into someone stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. As she watched her workers move with purpose, Wanjiku realized that she had not only built a business but had also created opportunities for others. Young women like her were learning the value of hard work, discipline, and courage. She smiled, knowing that her success was not just measured in money or customers, but in the lives she touched and inspired along the way. Her story was no longer only hers, it was a message for everyone who had ever been undervalued, insulted, or doubted. Turning toward the door as more customers entered, she spoke softly, almost as if telling herself, "Never let someone's insult define your worth. The same mouth that calls you nothing will one day witness your greatness." She knew this truth now more than ever. The man who once belittled her could only stand and watch, powerless against the woman she had become. Her strength had been forged in betrayal, molded by determination, and polished by resilience. Wanjiku's eyes shone with pride, not just for what she had achieved, but for who she had become. Respect those who lift you in your lowest moments, she thought, because they may rise higher than anyone ever imagined. She had lived this lesson, and now it flowed through every stitch she sewed, every life she touched, and every success she earned. Her story, once filled with pain, had become a beacon of hope and empowerment, destined to inspire countless others.